Hey, welcome back to Managerial Accounting here at Stevenson University. We have made it about halfway through the semester now, and we are going to be exploring a concept called relevant costs for short-term decisions. And we're going to roll through a couple of scenarios and examples of how we use cost information for our short-term decisions. So we'll look at how we look at short-term business decisions. We'll talk about the different approaches that we have when it comes to cost and how we select our pricing for products that we sell. We'll also look at situations where you might receive a special order and then we have to decide whether to accept it or not. We'll also look at whether we need to discontinue a product, department, or store location. We will also look at constraints that we have when it comes to our product mix decisions when we have multiple products that we sell. We'll look at the decision of outsourcing, whether we make the product in-house or we purchase it from somewhere else. We will look at whether to sell a product as is or process it further. And we'll also do some data analytics. So first, let's talk about how we describe and identify information when it comes to our short-term business decisions. So this step shows an illustration of a manager pointing at a linear graph, which is a graph of target profit and market share. So the first thing we do is we need to figure out what our goals are. And so management typically gets together, they discuss what the goals should be, and then they uh, um, select their goals. And then the next thing to do is to look at our alternative options to meet those goals. So, for example, for us to be able to earn a certain target profit, I might be looking at purchasing a piece of machinery, and I have two options to purchase that piece of machinery. Or another example would be should we produce the inventory in-house, meaning make it ourselves, or should we outsource it, right? So these are alternative courses of action. So we first identify our goals, and we look at our courses of action to meet those goals. The next thing we need to do in the decision-making process in selecting an alternative course of action is to gather as much cost data as possible. Now, the data that we gather needs to be relevant. What that means is that it must be relevant to the decision that we're making. So I'm not going to consider data that is not relevant, right? So if it's a sunk cost, meaning that cost was spent and it has no impact on a future decision, that's an irrelevant cost. So I'm only going to look at our relevant cost information. Then I will select the best alternative possible, whichever one typically is going to cost us the least and generate the highest possible revenue is typically the best alternative. We'll then implement that decision and we'll see how it does. And then we'll follow up uh, by comparing the actual results with what was anticipated, right? Or actual versus budget, right? Actual versus planned. And then we'll go through and reevaluate and we'll make similar decisions using the same model. So when we look at relevant information, we're looking at what's relevant to the decision, right? So here we're looking at if the information is critical to the future of the operation, and we're going to look at the differences between the alternatives. So, relevant information would include things like our sales projections, what the future outlook is expected to be, and we'll also look at our alternative decisions and what the impact of our future will be. So that's those pieces of information are relevant to the decision-making process. When it comes to our short-term decision making, we're looking at, as it says, in the short term, so 12 months or less. Uh, and we use an incremental approach. So we're looking at what the impact to our operating income would be under each alternative incrementally, right? So each additional sales dollar incrementally. We ignore irrelevant information in our decision-making process. I had earlier mentioned a sunk cost. A sunk cost is a cost that has already occurred and has no impact on the future of the decision. It is a sunk cost. A sunk cost is irrelevant. So we do not consider sunk cost information. We only focus on relevant costs and relevant revenue and relevant profits, which is generated from that future decision. We commonly use a contribution margin approach that separates out the variable from the fixed cost, just like we talked about last week when we talked about our contribution margin ratio, and we've applied that to the income statement. We follow that same logic when we talk about short-term decision making. So, what types of decisions do managers make in the short term? Well, the first and most obvious one is probably the price of the unit that we're trying to sell. So, what should our sales price be? Well, we can do a cost plus approach, we can do a markup approach, whatever. We got to figure out how much to sell our product for. And so that's one of the most common types of decisions that management's faced with in the short run. The second type is a special order. This is where a customer comes to us and says, hey, uh, I really want you to make 100 units of this basketball just for me, and I would like a special price because I'm buying in bulk. That's a special order. So customer comes to you and says, hey, I want 100 units, but I want it at a lower price than what you normally charge per unit. That's a special order. It's like buying in bulk, special order. Uh, in the short term, management's also faced with a decision to discontinue products, departments, or stores. I've been talking about Peloton as an example in this class, and as you know, Peloton tends to struggle sometimes, and their margins on the treadmill is really bad. It's like 10%. On their elliptical, 15%, rowing machine, 20%. Peloton has to make a decision. Should we discontinue making the treadmill, right? Oh, and if we do that, maybe it will shut down an entire department. Okay, so these things happen. And sometimes, like large retailers, they have to make the unfortunate decision whether to close stores or not. Most recent news, I'm sure you've noticed, is that Starbucks has made a decision to close 6,000 stores across the country. And these stores are underperforming, meaning their sales are pretty low in comparison to the other nearby stores, or maybe there's overlap in the market. So those stores might be primed to be shut down. So those are common management decisions in the short run. Managers also look at the product mix when resources are constrained. So, for example, if Peloton is making treadmills, ellipticals, and rowing machines, they can only make so much, that only up to 100% of their capacity at the warehouse. So if you can only do 100% capacity, you might make, a certain percentage of treadmills, certain percentage of rowing machines, and a certain percentage of the ellipticals. And so how do we decide how much of each unit to make? It depends on our available resources. And so we might need to shift our capacity around. The next management decision that we commonly make is do we make the product in-house or do we outsource it? What Peloton could do is that they can keep making the treadmill in-house, or maybe they'll make a contract deal with a real popular treadmill company that specializes in making treadmills, and they'll outsource the operation of making the treadmills to that company. It's certainly possible. And another decision that managers are commonly faced in the short term is, do we sell it as it is or do we process it further? The example I like to give with this one is gasoline. Gasoline is a byproduct of petroleum, oil, right? We can make a whole lot of different products with oil, with raw petroleum. And so we pump the oil from the ground. We can sell it in barrels as it is, or we can process it further into byproducts. We can process it into gasoline, kerosene, or some other fuel, right? So we can sell it as it is in its raw form, or we can process it further. These are the very six most common short-term decisions that management faces on a regular basis. Couple of things to be aware of and things to avoid as you're making these decisions. One of those is the sunk costs. These costs that have already happened, so they're not going to have an impact on the future. For example, Peloton already made 100 units of the treadmill and they're sitting in the warehouse. That's a sunk cost. It already happened. It's irrelevant, right? I can't change that. I already spent that money. It's a sunk cost. So we can avoid using unit costs unless they're purely variable costs. So these are things to try to avoid. And of course, it's important that the companies try to work with sustainability in mind, people, planet, and profit, right? The triple bottom line, as we say, people, planet, and profit. Do right by the people that work for you and the local community. Do right by the environment that's around the factory. And of course, do right by your shareholders, profitability. Okay. Example here from Nike, doing business that will have the environmental impact. In other words, reduce the impact on the natural environment. Try to get to a zero waste situation by 2020. Reuse shoe program to encourage recycling. Nike has a code of conduct that they use for their employees to promote a good working environment. They have a diverse and inclusive workforce that promotes a good working environment. And on the profitability side, invest at least 1.5% of pre-tax revenue in the community with respect to initiative. That typically helps to bolster the local economy and also eventually has an impact on the triple bottom line. So the next thing I'd like to talk about very briefly is our pricing. Pricing, as I'd mentioned, is probably the first and most important decision, short-term decision that management makes, is how do we price our product? Well, there's a couple questions we need to ask ourselves when we select our sales price is what should our target profit be, right? Obviously, if my objective is to earn $100,000 in profit, then I want to make sure that I build that into my price, right? And we talked about that last week. We should also be aware of how much our customers are willing to pay. For those of you who have taken economics already, you probably remember a term called willingness to pay. And that term is exactly that. We have to understand how much customers are willing to pay for products in order for us not to price it too high where they're not going to buy any or too low where they're buying too much. And of course, another question we need to ask ourselves is, are we a price taker or price setter for this product? Now, if you're a price taker, that typically means that We are real heavy in competition. We primarily compete on price. We don't have a brand name. The product lacks uniqueness. We're only in it to try to copy the competitor and match them on price. Okay, that's a price taker. Examples of price takers would be, um, let's say, Vizio televisions. Vizio and would be a price taker, whereas Samsung would be a price setter. Okay, just to give you an example of that. A price setter, the product's a little bit more unique. The brand is well known, a little bit less competition, and they tend to approach price on a cost plus price emphasis. So that's the primary difference between price takers and price setters. So how do we make the decision? We got to figure out if the company is a price taker or a price setter. And then we got to figure out if it's going to be target cost approach or a cost plus approach, depending on if we're a price taker or price setter. So a relatively straightforward decision-making rule. When it comes to cost plus, it's a very simple formula. We take our total cost of making the product, we add in our desired profit, and we subtract out the or I'm sorry, that gives us the cost plus approach. So the total cost of making the product plus the desired profit, that gives us the cost plus approach. Very simple. We can apply that to an example. Here we have some information. We have our variable costs and fixed costs. This is Garnier's shampoo brand. As you know, I believe this is a product that is made by Procter and Gamble, if I'm not mistaken. So we have our variable costs, we have our fixed costs, so which in turn will give us our total cost. We have some other additional information, number of units that we need to produce, the capacity that we have available, our total assets cost, I'm sorry, total asset value, our desired return on our assets, also known as our internal rate of return. And then we also have an absorption cost per unit plus our fixed manufacturing overhead divided by the number of units, giving us an absorption cost per unit of $2. So, using our cost plus approach and knowing what our data, we have to first separate out our variable from our fixed costs. So, variable manufacturing, it's the variable cost per unit times number of units. Variable operating per unit times number of units. And then we have our fixed costs, fixed manufacturing, and our fixed operating. We add all of those together to get our total costs. We then add in our desired profit. So if desired profit is 10%, we'll multiply that by our total assets to get $1 million in this case, which means that adding our cost plus our desired profit means we should have a desired sales revenue of $8 million. We divide that by the number of units we expect to sell, giving a cost plus price of $3.20 per unit. So that's how we apply the cost plus approach. Uh, so, in management, we have to figure out, are the customers going to be willing to pay that much? $3.20. Is that worth it? So we might use focus groups and test marketing to identify if the cost is too high or too low, or just right in some cases. So when it comes to target costing, which is the next approach I like to talk about, the idea here is that we have a targeted total cost. And the way that we calculate this is we take our total sales at market price minus the desired profit. That gives us what we would like our total cost to be. Total target cost. So using our same example from Garnier shampoo, uh, our expected sales expected to sell 2.5 million units at a sale price of $3 per unit. We subtract out our desired profit of $1 million in this case to get a target total cost of 6.5 million. We can compare that to our current total cost that we got from our earlier example of 7 million with a difference or total reduced cost of 500,000. That's just a nice way of comparing the two. So if we go with target costing, we can save about 500,000 in total cost. And so the company would need to figure out our options in order to reduce that total cost by 500,000. We can reduce our fixed costs, variable cost per unit, our branding, product differentiation, and adding more products, or we can accept a lower profit. So these are just some options. And so the company has identified that we can save about 100,000 in fixed costs. And so we just subtract that out from our fixed costs. We'll take our target total cost minus our fixed costs, which include the 100,000 savings at 3.150, getting us a target total variable cost of 3.350. We divide that by the number of units we expect to sell, giving us a target variable cost per unit of $1.34. Uh, and we can compare that $1.34 to the current variable cost per unit of $1.50, giving us a total reduction in unit cost of 16 cents. Right? This is a great way of us being able to compare our target cost to our cost plus approach. Another decision that management is oftentimes faced with is with accepting a special order. A special order, as I had mentioned earlier, is when a customer requests a large bulk quantity type of order, and we need to figure out whether to accept that order or not. It's typically at a reduced sale price on a per unit basis for a large quantity. Do we have the ability to do this? Do we have the capacity? If it's at a reduced sales price, will it be enough to cover our cost? Will the special order affect our regular sales along the way? So these are all considerations that we need to make. And so using our earlier example from Garnier shampoo, if it has a sale price of $3.20, we have a customer called Aldi, who is a grocery outlet store. They approached Garnier and said, "Hey, we'll buy 20,000 bottles of shampoo from you at $1.60 per bottle." So, that's it's kind of a low price, but we got to figure out, well, is it worth it for us in the long run? Aldi also wants us to provide them with their own label, uh, which will save Garnier 15 cents per bottle on the label. This is a very common practice in business. We call it private label. So if you ever shop at like a Costco or a Walmart or whatever, and they have their own brand, just know that that brand that they have, it's actually made by the same manufacturer that has the brand name. Yes. So just a little food for thought next time you're out shopping. Um, so Aldi says, hey, we got our own label, so save Garnier 15 cents per bottle. Aldi will also pay for the shipping. There's no sales commission on the order, and Garnier will have to pay $2,000 in legal fees to drop the contract. So a lot of data here. So the first thing we got to do is figure out, do we have the capacity, or does Garnier have the capacity to fulfill this order? Our capacity is 2.6 million bottles of shampoo to produce. We currently have production of 2.5 million. So the short answer is yeah, we can do it. Garnier can, we have the capacity. So what about the incremental cost for the order? We know that the variable cost will be $1.20 per bottle. We'll end up saving 15 cents per bottle because of the label, right? Reduced cost in labeling. So that will give us a total variable cost for the special order of $1.05 per shampoo bottle. So overall, seems like a pretty good deal to me. The next question we ask is, are the fixed costs affected by the order? Well, so when it comes to fixed costs for the warehouse, no, because it's within our existing capacity. However, there is that $2,000 legal fees that we'll have in addition to drop the contract. So from that perspective, yeah, we'll have an additional 2,000 in fixed costs. So let's fill it out to see if it makes sense to us to see if it'll affect our regular sales. So from the revenue from the order is $1.60 per unit. That's of course, yeah, $1.60 per unit. 20,000 units for the order. It's 32,000 in potential revenue. The variable cost is $1.05 per unit at 21,000. Revenue minus your variable cost, getting us to 11,000 contribution margin, or 55 cents per unit contribution margin per unit. Minus our fixed cost additional of the 2,000, giving us a total increased operating income from the order of $9,000. So yeah, this is a great deal. I would do this deal all day long for sure. So the decision is, do we accept or reject it? If the incremental revenue exceeds the cost, then yeah, we'll do the deal. If the incremental revenue is less than our cost, then no, or we won't do that deal. That's the decision-making process. Some things to avoid: never compare the special order sales price with the absorption cost per unit. Use the contribution margin approach. Yeah, pretty straightforward. All right. The next thing that management commonly looks at when it comes to making decisions is to discontinue a product, department, or a store. Gave you the example of Peloton. Should they discontinue the treadmill? Should Starbucks close more of their stores? Should Peloton close down one of their departments? Right. Very, very common decisions that we make. So we need to understand what our product mix is and what our resources that are constrained, whether to make the product or outsource it or sell the product as it is or process it further. So let's break each one of these down. Looking at the decisions to discontinue products, departments, or stores. Well, there's a couple questions that management needs to ask is, does the product provide a positive contribution margin? If it does, then you should probably keep the product. Are there any fixed costs that could be avoided if we discontinue the product? I gave the early example of Peloton. Uh, so as you know, with fixed costs, we have to pay those costs regardless if we're making the product or not, in some cases. So if we can save some, great. But if we need to continue paying those fixed costs, then that's not so great. Will discontinuing the product affect sales of the company's other products? Maybe the other products will increase in sales. Maybe they'll decrease. Who knows? And what could we do with the freed up capacity if we discontinue the product? We can produce more of the other products, I would think, right? So, but these are the questions that management needs to ask. So here's our Garnier company. As you know, Garnier makes several products. not just shampoo, but also styling products, skin moisturizers, and a whole bunch of other ones. I'd mentioned Garnier, I believe, is a part of Procter& and Gamble, the larger conglomerate, but Garnier does a wonderful job at making these types of products. So let's take a look at Garnier's company or the division within Procter& and Gamble. So here are the different product lines that Garnier has. We have our shampoo, styling products, and skin moisturizers. And we also have our sales revenue, as you can see, shampoo leading the way with 8 mil, 1.5 for the styling products, 500,000 for the skin moisturizer. Total revenue of 10 million. We have our variable manufacturing and operating costs separated out from our fixed, so that way we can calculate a proper contribution margin. So sales minus variable manufacturing minus variable operating gets us to a contribution margin. Then we subtract out our fixed manufacturing and fixed operating to get to our operating income. And as you can see, the skin moisturizer yields a negative operating income, meaning we have a loss from when making the skin moisturizer. This could be a good candidate for a product to eliminate, right? So that's something that Garnier needs to consider when we have a negative operating income. The contribution margin is positive, yeah, but the operating income is negative for that product. So yeah, this could be problematic. So let's see what Garnier decides to do. Uh, so in the decision-making process, we got to figure out contribution margin, positive or negative. In this case, it's positive. What fixed costs, if any, can be eliminated? If they're avoidable fixed costs, that means we could eliminate those fixed costs along with discontinuing the product. If they're unavoidable, that means we still have to pay them regardless of if we eliminate the product or not. So let's take a look. So here we have some information from Garnier. They were able to break out the total costs and our avoidable costs. And it looks like if we discontinue the line, we'll have some less janitorial services, less supervisory, indirect labor, a little bit less equipment that we're currently using a lease to pay for. We'll also have less advertising expense and less selling and administrative expense if we cut out the moisturizer product. So the rest of it, the rest of those costs from the total cost, those are your unavoidable costs. We cannot reduce those. So in this case, I'm really only saving 32,000 on the fixed manufacturing side and 45,000 on the fixed operating side. So if I add the two together, I get 77,000. It looks like I would save. Is that enough to get us back into the positive? Great question. So we roll through our incremental analysis. So the contribution margin that we would lose if we discontinue it was 124,500 minus the avoidable costs would give us a positive operating income lost if the moisturizer is discontinued of 47,500. So the company needs to make a decision here. Is this going to be beneficial if we cut out the moisturizer? So excellent question. And so we need to go through the decision rules. Will discontinue the product affect the sales of the other products? Maybe we'll sell more shampoo. Maybe we'll sell more of the other product. We don't know. Could managers make more profitable product or lease out the capacity to another company? Possibly, sure. So in the decision-making rule, if the contribution margin lost from the store exceeds the fixed cost savings, we do not discontinue the product. If the fixed costs exceed the contribution margin lost from discontinuing the product, then we do discontinue it. So, it's a tough call sometimes. Sometimes we need to discontinue. Sometimes we need to continue selling it even though we're not making money on it, right? So the rule of thumb here is that if your savings outweigh the cost of making it, then yeah, we'll discontinue it. But if they don't, all we're doing here is we're minimizing our loss, right? So that's part of the decision-making process. So the pitfalls here: don't base the decision based off of product line statements that include the allocation of fixed expense. We would prepare a segment margin uh, income statement instead. So just things to consider when discontinuing a product. Let's take a look at another decision-making element that management commonly is faced with, and that is how do we use our resources most effectively given our product mix? So the constraint is that we restrict the amount of product that a company can manufacture and sell. I can only make so much based off of my total capacity. And if I had two or more products, I need to allocate my resources accordingly. Now, the way we typically do this is based off of our product mix ratio, typically. Um, so we need to consider a couple things. What constraints are stopping us from selling all the units? What products offer the highest contribution margin? What emphasis on one product over another? What would it have on the other products? Right, great questions. So things we need to consider. So here we have an example of a company that sells two products. This company just so happens to sell t-shirts and jeans. Let's pretend they're Levi. Okay. So, so Levi, they sell their jeans for $60 a piece. They sell t-shirts at $30 a piece. Variable expenses for each are $48 and $12 respectively. The contribution margin for jeans is $12 for t-shirts. It's 18. Okay. Contribution margin ratio, as you know, is the variable cost. I'm sorry, the contribution margin over the sales price. Contribution margin ratio is contribution margin over the sale price. And so it's 60% for shirts and 20% for jeans. So we need to make the decision, should I make more jeans or more shirts? Yeah, so that's a great question. Sometimes we need to shift our operation, and oftentimes we base that off of our contribution margin ratio for each unit. So if I uh, increase my operating income for shirts by $18, I can make 10 shirts per machine hour. For each pair of jeans, if we increase operating income by $12, I can produce 20 pairs of jeans per machine hour. I have a total of 2,000 machine hours capacity. So this is my constraint, is the 2,000 hours. So what I need to do is plug those data into my formula to get my total contribution margin at full capacity. So I take my contribution margin per unit, I multiply that by the number of units produced per machine hour to get a contribution margin per machine hour. I then multiply that by the available capacity to get the total contribution margin at full capacity per type of product that I sell. So this information helps management to make a decision if we need to shift into making more of one product over another. Other considerations that would need to be involved in this decision would emphasizing one product over another have an effect of sales of the other product? Maybe. Fixed costs will not typically be affected because fixed are fixed. They're distributed evenly anyway. Other product sales would probably not be hurt. So, could making only jeans hurt the sales of the company's other products? Well, I mean, maybe. There's a good chance of that, right? So we would need to look at the company's demand. So the demand's limited to 30,000 pairs during the year. So in this case, we take the contribution margin per machine hour, multiply that by the number of machine hours devoted to each product to get the total contribution margin at full capacity. Now here we can see that I'm making a lot more jeans than I am shirts. Uh, so, you know, it depends. It really depends on management's objectives. So we need to use the correct operational sign when computing the contribution margin per machine hour. Units per hour, we take contribution margin divided by the sales price per unit times the number of units over the number of hours. That gives us contribution margin per machine hour in terms of units per hour. And then when it comes to hours per unit, it's contribution margin over the sale price divided by the number of hours divided by the number of units. That gives us the contribution margin per hour per unit. Okay. The next decision that management needs to make is, do we make it ourselves or do we outsource the product? We call this make or buy decision. Outsourcing is when we contract it with another company outside to produce or perform the service. So Peloton can contract with another company to produce and sell their treadmills, right? That's a form of outsourcing. We could also offshore the work. We could have the work performed overseas. It's called offshoring. The company typically operates their own manufacturing plants overseas. That's called offshore. Uh, Outsourcing overseas work to another company is another method of offshoring. We contract with our manufacturers to make the product for the other company. Yeah, so that's outsourcing. Couple of considerations that the company needs to consider before making an outsourcing decision. How do our variable cost per unit compare with the outsourced cost per unit? Are any fixed costs avoidable if we outsource? What would we do if we freed up the capacity if we outsourced? And what volume would we need to produce? Yeah, great questions. Here we have a great example. Sony decides whether to make its own earbuds or outsource them to another electronics company. Sony produces 2 million earbuds during a year. So we have the following information for per unit. Direct materials $4, direct labor 50 cents, variable manufacturing overhead $1.50. So total variable manufacturing cost per unit I'm sorry, $6. And looking at we multiply all of those by the 2 million. Total variable manufacturing cost is $12 million to create 2 million units. We add in our fixed manufacturing cost to get a total manufacturing cost. We divide that by the number of units to be produced, giving us a total cost per unit under absorption costing method of $8 per unit. So if it costs a total of $8 per unit, if we make it in-house, if the outsourced company is willing to provide us the earbuds for $7 a piece, that seems like a reasonable deal. The variable cost per unit is $6. So Sony could ultimately save 500,000 fixed costs per year by outsourcing, and they would have no other use for the freed up capacity. So giving that additional information, we can uh, make the comparison. So if we make it ourselves, the total cost would be 16 million. If we outsource it, uh, sure we save on fixed costs, but the outsource it goes up. There will be 17.5 million, giving us a difference of 1.5 million. So very considerable difference. We run through the alternative cost benefit analysis for this decision. We take the variable cost per unit to outsource minus the variable cost per unit to manufacture it, giving us our incremental variable cost per unit to outsource it, which gives us that additional dollar per unit. We multiply that by the number of units we need to produce. That gives us the incremental variable cost to outsource minus the cost savings in terms of fixed costs, giving us a net extra cost to outsource it of 1.5 million. So how do we make the decision? If the incremental costs exceed the incremental costs of outsourcing, then we outsource it. If the incremental costs are less than the incremental cost of outsourcing, then we do not outsource. That's the decision-making process. So we then calculate the cost of making the earbuds and compare that to the cost of outsourcing the earbuds. And to do this, we run out the variable cost plus our fixed costs on both sides. And as you can see, it's just a matter of solving for X, right? So um, we can see that the variable cost per unit total would be $6.25 per unit. Very similar to what we talked about last week. So let's assume that Sony can lease their additional capacity for 2.5 million. That of course will generate an additional 2.5 million in total income for the company, which would make this deal, probably a little bit more worth it. There's some benefits and drawbacks, of course, to outsourcing. Benefits is that we can concentrate on our core competencies, take advantage of the other company's expertise, reduce risk, and lower costs. The drawbacks include less control. Employees need to manage overseas relationship and often results in layoffs for employees. So we take the good with the bad, right? So that is our decision-making process on outsourcing. The next one we have is to decide to sell the product as it is or produce it further. The example I gave with this is oil. I can sell the crude oil as it is in a barrel, or I can process it further into gasoline, kerosene, or some other heating source. If we So questions we have to ask: if the how much revenue will be received if we sell it as it is? How much revenue will be received if we process it further? How much extra will it cost to process it further? Those are the key questions to ask. Bertolli, this is one of my favorite companies. They make a lot of olive oil. They also make a large variety of pastas. Bertolli very commonly makes olive oil. So they spend about $100,000 to process raw olives into 50,000 quarts of basic olive oil. Should the company spend more to process the olive oil into gourmet oils and dips? So we'll process it further into dips, right? So basic olive oil sells for $5 a quart for a total of 250,000. $5, of course, times the 50,000. Uh, so 250,000 if we just sell regular olive oil. If we produce it further into dips, we can sell it at $7 a quart for a total of $350,000 in revenue. Totally would have to spend an additional 75 cents per quart or 37,500 to process the oil further into a dip. So taking a look at the cost. So if we sell it as it is, we sell for 250,000. If we process it further, we can sell for 350,000, but we have an additional cost, 37,500. That's the 75 cents per quart additional cost. So as we can see, there is a difference, a net benefit difference of 62,500. So in this case, Bertolli should process the olive oil further into a dip. So the decision is, if the incremental revenue exceeds the additional cost, then yes, we process it further. If not, then we do not process it further. So that is the last management decision-making concept I wanted to talk about today. The next thing I'd like to talk about is our data analytics tools. So as you are already familiar with Excel, we can use Excel when it comes to special order requests, and we can figure out if a special order request is worth it or not. And the way that we can do this is by matching our models to our costs. And so here we have the different types of products. These look like mountain bikes. The quantity times the price per unit, quantity times price per unit gives us total revenue. We can look at the additional information, uh, direct materials, direct labor plus variable manufacturing overhead per unit, and our fixed cost of manufacturing overhead per unit. We add those two, we get total cost per unit. We do that for each unit, type of unit we produce. Management then use a VLOOKUP in Excel in order to find the most recent variable costs of producing each model. That's one area where Excel comes in handy is the VLOOKUP. Not one of my favorite functions, but it is very valuable to management when we're dealing with large data sets like this. Um, and then of course the process of how to use the VLOOKUP. We select the cells, uh, and we select where we want the information to be returned. Then we go to formulas, select lookup and reference, and then we put our values in. So lookup value, the table array, which is the range of cells where we want the information to be returned, and then OK. And then the information goes in, and then we can drag and drop down by filling out the form. So that is VLOOKUP. I would also recommend that you use Microsoft Copilot as an AI tool that is very good in this area as well. So for this week, looking into the classroom, you have for me two things. You have your week 8 homework assignment, but you also have the midterm exam that also needs to be completed. So my recommendation for success in this process is to complete your homework assignment first and then take the midterm exam afterward. Both of these need to be done by Sunday night. Please do not wait until Sunday night to complete the homework 8 assignment and the midterm exam. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can reach me by email or you can message me in the classroom and I'll be happy to respond. Thank you so very much for your time today. I appreciate all of you and I wish you all the very best. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye bye.